Welcome to Trust Talk. In this episode, we dive into what really happens when the trust between a company and its stakeholders falls apart, and how you can begin to rebuild it. My guest is Tiziana Gaito from the Hochschule für Wirtschaft in Zürich, Switzerland. Together with Antoinette Weibel and Sibylle Sachs, she wrote a study called A Case Study of Stakeholder Distrust Management in the Context of Sustainability Scandal. In their research, they follow a large organization that was caught up in a sustainability scandal. They show why managing distrust is very different from simply repairing trust, how clashing values and doubts about intent can quickly fuel tensions, and how a neutral third party and careful engagement, both in public and behind the scenes, can help turn things around. It's a rare behind-the-scenes look at the messy side of stakeholder relationships and the tough but rewarding path back to trust. Tiziana, welcome to Trust Talk. Your article takes us deep into how organizations manage stakeholder relationships when trust has broken down. I understand that the case study grew out of a sustainability scandal. Can you tell us a bit more about the scandal and what made this organization and situation such a rich setting for exploring distrust management?
Thank you, Severin, for the invitation, and I'm excited to talk to you today. You are asking about the sustainability scandal and about the setting, and I think our case proved quite revelatory because it was a large international organization that was affected by this scandal that created distrust mainly from external stakeholders in the sustainability area. They were NGOs, they were political organizations and associations that were engaged in this sustainability issue. I'm, because of data privacy, not able to go into much more details, but this is what I can say. And we were given access to interview partners at different levels, ranging from the top management to more operational functions, and thereby we were able to capture the complexity of the relational dynamics. And on the other hand, I also think that it was a unique opportunity to study distrust given the extent to which the company was affected by the scandal and by stakeholder distrust, because people usually don't like talking about what went wrong. We all prefer to talk about the positive side of things. So there was also distrust or suspicion against us as researchers at the beginning. What would we write about them? What would we do with the data? And it took us really several months of trust building with the company representatives so that we could do the interviews at the end. And that's why I think it was a really unique opportunity to study this case.
You and your co-authors argue that distrust management is very different from traditional trust repair. What are the key differences you observed?
To understand the differences between distrust management and trust repair, I think it is important to understand the unique characteristics of distrust and how they differ from trust. So someone who distrusts is really convinced that another person is out there to harm. And when there is this perception of harmful intention, this creates a state of defensiveness in which the behaviors of that person, or if you are talking about interorganizational relationships of multiple persons as representatives of companies and organizations, that these behaviors are fully aiming at self-protection. So in our study, distrust between the company and its stakeholders was mutual because of the distrustful actions by the stakeholders after the scandal had become public. The company representatives thought that they had to really fight the stakeholders, which they saw as enemies. Not fighting with weapons, of course, but with tactics by ending relationships, cutting communications, and by also engaging in conflict and in legal disputes. And you can imagine things can get very emotional. Emotions can taint our rational thinking. So there is more and more a tunnel vision that directs people's actions. And because in our study, the company representatives and the stakeholders were trapped in this intractable state, they were not necessarily from the company side motivated to take constructive and de-escalating action. But trust repair generally assumes that company representatives would recognize the trust violation and then do whatever is most likely to restore. This might not be the case.
You and your co-authors identify what's called value incongruence and what you also mentioned, perceived malevolence, as two main drivers of stakeholder distrust. First of all, maybe you can explain a little bit what these terms mean and how do they interact and how did they actually play out in your case?
Value incongruence is a key driver of distrust, and in our study we observed it in that there are perceivably fundamentally different values on how sustainability issues should be approached. On the one side, the company had a focus on financial values driven by profit maximization and by market power. And on the other hand, there were the stakeholders who focused on the sustainability related values. And this created an incompatibility on the basic principles with which business is done. And I think here we can also refer to a podcast you had with Sim Sitkin, who is also writing and doing research about this value incongruence. And he says that to overcome this value incongruence, it is very important to build an understanding and to try to move on from there and build trust. And this is really also something that we discovered in our study, that this neutral understanding is key to move on. But this is a large effort and a major process to reach that understanding and requires quite a lot of interaction. But this interaction was not possible in our case because of the distrust at first.
You describe 3 critical incidents in the company's journey from scandal to rebuilding dialogue. Can you walk us through those incidents and explain how each escalated or reduced distrust? Till now you talked about value incongruence, but my question also relates to perceived malevolence. What about that?
Yes, that was another element of distrust that was interacting with value incongruence, because it referred to the perception of the stakeholders that the company was not credible in their communication. So the interaction part that was important to mitigate distrust was not possible because what the company was saying was perceived as lies, and stakeholders were saying that we don't want to talk to you anymore as a company and we are breaking off the dialogue. So this was really mutual state of distrust. These are 3 incidents that are related with 3 periods of distrust management. And the first one was the quick development of this entrenched state of mutual distrust that trapped the company in this negative state after the scandal has become public. And a major factor that facilitated this state of mutual distrust was the organizational disposition of the company, that they were very narrowly focused on profit maximization and so also had a narrow focus on stakeholder engagement, focusing only on those ones who had market power and financial value. And this influenced the reaction after the scandal that was very defensive at first. The second incident was that the company realized that a change on their ends is inevitable. So the pressure was mounting. It was also financially and harmful for the company and also in terms of their reputation. So they became under a lot of pressure to do something and then developed this willingness to change, not because they were interested in the stakeholder side, but really out of their own interest. And the third critical incident was a change of perception on the stakeholder side. So this was when the company, also with the help of the third party that was very helpful, achieved a breakthrough in stakeholder distrust. And this is not that trust was suddenly built, but it is what we call suspicion that developed, so that many stakeholder relationships remained also suspicion for quite a long time. It's not as destructive as distrust, but it is a state where you can have interaction, but there is a lot of doubts going on, and this question, are they lying now or not? So very careful evaluation always.
You just mentioned the role of the third party, obviously a very central role in the process. What did they do that the company itself could not? And why was their neutrality so crucial?
Yes, indeed. The third party was very important in this process of distrust management, because once the company had developed the readiness to do something about the situation, they realized that it was not possible for them to interact with the stakeholders and to get that message through to them. And one of the big problems was here this perceived malevolence, the discredibility that stakeholders were not believing anything that came from company representatives. So the third party was an important bridge between the company and the stakeholders, because they were perceived as credible and trusted by both sides. And this is also why the aspect of neutrality is so important, because if the third party is perceived as too close to one side or the other, then it cannot really act as this mediator of messages, so to say.
You also write about reaching a state of what you call fragile acceptance. What does that look like in practice, and what can organizations do to avoid sliding back into distrust?
This fragile acceptance relates to the third episode that I was talking before about the changed stakeholder perception. It was when this destructive distrust has gone away, but there was still a lot of suspicion, and stakeholders were very carefully evaluating the communication and also the action of the company. It means that although they were very suspicious, they gave the company a chance to show how they are changing, but now the company had to show that they are really also taking this opportunity seriously. So there had to be a lot of coherence within the company. They had to make sure that what they communicate on the outside was also implemented on the inside, and they had to make sure that the leaders, but also the employees at all the levels, they support these changes and believe in them as well.
Of course, interestingly enough, in the article you also describe a process model, and you highlight both what's called front stage engagement, meaning what happens publicly, and backstage engagement, so the more confidential behind the scenes work. How can organizations balance these, and why is internal alignment so important?
The internal alignment or the coherence that I was referring to before is so important because it affects how credible the external engagement is perceived. And what we observed in our study was that the external engagement then happened on two levels. At the front stage, it was important to reach a broad audience. It was important to replace many of the people who were associated with the scandal, but also to not simply fix the mistakes, but really to show that the company is going out of its way to create a new strategy and to turn around things in principle. So here we can see that they were really trying to gain some alignment on the values side and to be a potential ally in these sustainability issues. But at the backstage, it was equally important to engage because of this malevolence issue, because there they were able to talk with individual peoples to rebuild relationships based on interpersonal interactions and interpersonal trust, to really strengthen the credibility and to show to the stakeholders that their concerns were listened to and transported into the company. This was equally important.
In the research, you didn't just look at one company and one stakeholder, you look at a whole network of people and organizations. How did distrust and efforts to deal with it ripple through those wider networks?
Well, we didn't specifically look at how the mitigation of distrust was passed on from one stakeholder to another, but what we observed is that it is all about people and relationship building. So first you need to be genuine about the changes and walk the talk as a company, but then the individual credibility of people is also very important to transmit the messages and to be seen as someone who listens to stakeholder concerns.
For leaders or communicators listening to this podcast, facing stakeholder distrust after a scandal, what is the first step they should take and what's one pitfall they should avoid?
I think the first step is or can be to take a step back and observe the situation, what is going on, and also ask themselves, what is my perception about the situation? What are my potential biases? Because suspicion, which can be an antecedent of distrust, is not necessarily bad. It helps us be aware of potentially harmful situations and react to them appropriately. But the danger is that then one gets sucked in too much into a situation of distrust that becomes destructive very fast. So I think, and when we are in distrust, we are not rational anymore, even though we may not realize it, but then it's really not helpful anymore. So I think a first important step can also be to engage a neutral third party to help make sense of the situation, advise on next step, and guide constructive communication. And the pitfall you were also asking is, I think, to forget to listen to the stakeholders. So really listen more and talk less.
In general, that's very good advice, I think. Looking back, what do you see as your article's most important contribution to understanding stakeholder engagement in moments of crisis?
Something that I like about the study is the complex dynamics of distrust management that we were able to uncover with the study. It's not a couple of repair practices that fix the situation, but really a long process that happens at all levels of the company. And I think although these process dynamics, they are, or I have to say, empirical studies about distrust are available in some recent work is there, but still process dynamics and empirical work are quite rare also because it is hard to get the data because of the sensitivity of the topic most of the times when we talk about distrust.
In many of my podcast interviews, I end with a question about the future. So also for you, what questions or areas in distrust management would you like to see future research explore?
I think related to our study, it would be interesting to explore distrust management in different contexts. For example, in our case, the company had a very hierarchical and profit-oriented approach to stakeholder management, which then influenced how they would react to the scandal. But I wonder whether distrust would have emerged in the same way if the company had a more collaborative approach to stakeholder management from the beginning. So this would be one question. And the other question also is that our study focused on external stakeholders, but I could expect some differences in terms of distrust management if the distrust came mainly from internal stakeholders. And I think these are questions that are very relevant, especially when we look at some of the current societal development, like the polarization of values, like the changing expectations in terms of the purpose of a business and its engagement with social and ecological issues. So if we want to understand how companies can have more peaceful and more impactful relationships with stakeholders in the sense that they approach stakeholder management as something with the goal to create value not only for them as companies, but also for the stakeholders, then it's very important to have a good understanding of distrust prevention, but also of distrust management.
Tiziana, thank you very much for the interview. I especially liked it to talk with you and to read your article with your co-authors, because as you know, we are very interested in bridge the issues between what's found in science and how that can be used in practice. And practice, I mean the advisors, the consultants in the trust business, so to speak. And I think your study is a wonderful contribution to that. And I thank you for explaining what you have found and how that can be helped to manage distrust in an organization. Thank you for that. And my last question, what is your next research project you will be doing?
I think one of the research projects that I am working on currently is also case study that I do with a group of researchers where we look at how stakeholder engagement can serve to implement sustainability within organizations, where there is also a lot of relational work and trust building needed. And there I'm very curious about the results.
Interesting. Well, I'm sure that we, I mean also our listeners, will follow these developments. And thank you for being our guest today and wish you all the best with your research.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to Trust Talk. I hope today's conversation gave you new perspectives on the power of trust. If you feel these interviews help deepen our understanding of trust, please consider supporting the podcast. Your donation, no matter the size, helps me continue these meaningful conversations. Visit trusttalk.co/donate to contribute and be part of this journey. Thank you for listening, and I hope you'll join me again for the next episode.